Welcome and/or welcome back to our study of Uncommon. This is the study that we have been going through for the last couple of weeks in the beginning part of the book of Acts. And I'm Pastor Brad, and I'm with
Pastor Allen. Good morning, or I say morning, whatever time it is when you're watching this.
We're delighted that you have decided to join us. As we were thinking about this as a pastoral team, I had this very specific image in mind, which was my group of friends sitting in a coffee shop talking about the scriptures that I used to gather with at Panera. And so we are thinking about this sort of as a conversation that we're inviting you in on, that we're having about the book of Acts. We've entitled it Uncommon, Bold and Unhindered, to pick up on those two key words that show up over and over in the book of Acts. Here's where we've been so far. On the first week, we talked about an uncommon boldness with the early disciples within the church proclaiming the gospel, and even amidst persecution, their prayer wasn't that persecution or hardship would go away, but rather that they proclaimed the gospel with even greater boldness. What an uncommon way to pray in a difficult time. And then in week 2, we talked about uncommon generosity and the way in which the early church was so generous with what they were given by God. This week, we are talking about uncommon acceptance. But before we get there, I want to give you a little bit of an introduction, because we read through a little bit of chapter 3 and chapter 4, then we read through a little bit of chapter 4 and chapter 5. We're skipping just a few chapters, so I want to give you an introduction to what we're going to be talking about. By way of chapter 1, actually, Jesus' final words to his disciples were, "Go therefore into all nations," and actually, that's the Matthew text,
Yeah.
but
starting in Jerusalem.
in Jerusalem,
right, yeah.
then all of Judea and to Samaria and all the ends of the earth.
Ripples out, right.
And so that is the map, actually, by which Acts is going to be organized. And we started in Jerusalem, as we talked about.
Right.
The disciples gathered at a couple different parts of the day in Jerusalem where they would meet, and then what we're going to see in chapter 6 is that 7 new people are brought into the fold, and those new people actually start having challenges right away. One of them is named Stephen. In chapter 6 at the very end, and then into chapter 7, Stephen actually is seized and finds himself in front of the Sanhedrin, and he ends up getting stoned by the Sanhedrin.
First martyr. First person to die for the faith.
Exactly. And so, after he's martyred, what we see happen is that it no longer is safe for them to proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ in Jerusalem. So they begin to be scattered. In fact, Stephen being stoned led to the fulfillment of what was said in verse 1:8, which is that they're going to go into all these different places in Judea, into Samaria, and to all the ends of the earth. And so it was really the persecution of the church that led that to happen. So in the beginning of chapter 8, which we're going to be talking about today, we see that the church is starting to have challenges. It says, "On that great day, a persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem, and that led to the disciples being scattered." We're going to pick it up with one of them, whose name is Philip. He goes first up to Samaria.
And also one of those 6, like Stephen. So he's not an apostle. He's one of those new leaders, lay leaders that was pulled together. Yeah.
Exactly. So Philip goes up to Samaria. He proclaims the gospel in Samaria. And then we've got our really interesting text for today. It's going to be a fun one for us to dive into. This is the passage we're going to read. It's the book of Acts, chapter 8, verses 26 through 40. "Now, an angel of the Lord said to Philip, 'Go south to the road, the desert road, that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza.' So he started out, and on his way he met an Ethiopian eunuch, an important official in charge of all the treasury of the Kandake, which means Queen of the Ethiopians. This man had gone to Jerusalem to worship, and on his way home was sitting in his chariot reading the book of Isaiah the prophet. The Spirit told Philip, 'Go to that chariot and stay near it.' Then Philip ran up to the chariot and heard the man reading Isaiah the prophet. 'Do you understand what you're reading?' Philip asked. 'How can I,' he said, 'unless someone explains it to me?' So he invited Philip to come up and sit with him. This is the passage of Scripture the Ethiopian eunuch was reading. He was led like a sheep to the slaughter, and as a lamb before its shearer is silent, so he did not open his mouth. In his humiliation, he was deprived of justice. Who can speak of his descendants? For his life was taken from the earth. The eunuch asked Philip, "Tell me, please, who is the prophet talking about? Himself or someone else?" Then Philip began with that very passage of Scripture and told him the good news about Jesus. As they traveled along the road, they came to some water, and the eunuch said, "Look, here is water. What can stand in the way of my being baptized?" And he gave orders to stop the chariot. Then both Philip and the eunuch went down into the water, and Philip baptized him. When they came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord suddenly took Philip away, and the eunuch did not see him again, but went on his way rejoicing. Philip, however, appeared at Azotus and traveled about, preaching the gospel in all the towns until he reached Caesarea.
What a great story. And it's really two main characters. Well, the Spirit is the main guider here. These two characters, Philip and this eunuch, intriguing. You mentioned about Philip, like Stephen, this first layer, as the church began to organize itself, realizing that now this is going on for a period of time, and I'm sure at first they thought Jesus was coming back in 10 days or something, but as they realized this is going to be a little longer, it took some organization, and the apostles were so busy doing preaching and teaching that they didn't really have time to administrate the church. So in some ways, though it doesn't say they're deacons or elders, but these 6 lay people, Hellenistic Jews, of which Stephen and Philip are 2, are really the first round of the church realizing we need to do this in an orderly way. And particularly, the rub was that when they were gathering for their common meals, there were people who were feeling a little left out, and it had to be what's fair and what's right, and there was some policing of that to be done. And so that was this original deacon kind of job, was just caring for the flock, pastoral care, you might say, organization, leadership. What strikes me is that Stephen and Philip, I don't know about the others, but Stephen and Philip go way beyond that initial job description, because they were not called aside originally to go preach and die for your faith, go to Samaria and out running in the desert, and yet these two guys who did their work that they were assigned, the Spirit kind of blew up their job description. Exactly. And I'm struck that there's a lay movement to this too. Sometimes we get the impression it's the paid clergy, who are doing the work of the church, and the other people just provide the donations or something. That was never true. From the beginning, it was not true. We have to remember, Philip is a lay person. He's not an apostle. Right. And yet he's out here preaching, which I guess says to all of us, we all have a calling. This boldness and all that we're asking for, this is for all of us. So Philip, and I'm struck that what the text says, the angel just says, go to the desert. He doesn't say, there's going to be someone there I want you to meet, and you're going to convert him, this is all going to be good, trust me. It's just go. It's kind of like Abraham and Sarah, go, and I'll tell you when you get there. It's just this bold. And Philip doesn't say, well, why or how far, or Lord, don't you know it's a desert road, it's not safe. In fact, there's some sense that both of our Bibles say that he asked him to go on the road going south. That Greek phrase could also be translated to go at noon. So imagine you're Philip, and you're being called to go at noon into the desert, and you don't even know why you're being asked to go. It doesn't seem like a very smart thing to do, and yet Philip so any great act of God begins with some obedience.
Right.
Someone who's just willing to say, Lord, I'm going to trust you on this. So he goes, which is striking to me. Now the other guy, of course, is a eunuch. This is a black man. He's from Africa, Ethiopia. According to the maps of the known world and the Roman world at that time, Ethiopia was at the very edge of the map. It was as far as they knew. So this guy has come from Timbuktu, from
the ends of the earth.
The absolute ends of the earth, to use an Acts 1:8 metaphor. So this is as far away as you can come. It's about 1,000 miles from Ethiopia to Jerusalem. Now, 1,000 miles is a long way if you're just relocating from Indiana to Florida, but imagine doing it in this environment, through the hostile kind of environment, hostile from people and hostile from weather. that he would have to go, and yet he takes a 1,000-mile journey from Ethiopia to Jerusalem, and he's not there on an ambassador mission. I guess he's finally gotten some off time. I don't know. He's retired. I don't know how it is that he got away, but he's not. He didn't escape, but he took some significant time. Must have gotten permission from the Queen.
Right.
He's in effect the Secretary of the Treasury, very high ranking, and he got permission for what surely was several months to go all the way to Jerusalem. And you wonder, why would he take such a trip? Because, of course, what it tells us about him doesn't tell us his name, but it does tell us a very important description of his condition. He's a eunuch. It's hard to be sensitive about how to say this, but what that means is, as a young boy, he would have been probably a slave, but they picked out the very brightest of the slaves, and the very brightest and best, smartest, most aptitude, most likely to succeed of the boys. They would make them surgically genderless, and they would do that. It's a terrible thing, of course, but they weren't doing it to torture them. They were doing it really so that this person would be totally and only devoted to the service of the government or of the owner, meaning they would never be tempted to be married or to have children. They would never have any of that. There would never be a time where this eunuch would say to the queen, who wanted him to work a weekend, well, I can't, my son has a baseball team,
Right.
Or it's our anniversary. There'd never be a time that this eunuch could deny being a company man,
Right.
24/7, because he doesn't have any other distractions in his life. And it's a tragic mutilation that they did, but they did it so they could have the total all-in devotion, which makes me wonder sometimes. I've known of people who felt kind of like the company wanted them to be company man like that too. Or company woman. Mm-hmm. And there are some companies where no matter what was going on in your family, the company mattered all. Well, that's kind of the way this company was.
Right.
But this guy was completely removed of any temptation to have another excuse. So he's really gone through a lot already. Now, he has risen. Boy, they picked out a brightest and best. He's now risen all the way to be in charge of the entire.
It's like a Joseph story.
It's
almost.
a Joseph's. It is in charge of all of Pharaoh's.
Yeah.
Precisely from slavery to an enormous level responsibility, and he's got his own chariot. He's got enough off time to go to Jerusalem. He's got enough money to own a copy, at least, of the scroll of Isaiah. I don't know how much of the Old Testament, but that was rare, right?
Right.
People didn't have. How many Bibles do you have at home? Right? You have like lots of them out. But in this century, even the Jewish people didn't have their own copies of the Old Testament. There might be one copy of the Torah at the synagogue, but people didn't have their own copies of the Bible. That was just, there wasn't enough paper or vellum. In fact, it took about the hides of 400 donkeys to create enough of the vellum of the parchment that you'd have to have. And so the donkey union didn't want everybody to have a copy of the Bible, if nothing else. It was just too expensive. This guy has a copy, at least, of the scroll of Isaiah.
Right.
Talk about wealth. I mean, he's driving a Bentley here already, just the fact that he's got that. So he's a very wealthy man with a lot of prestige. He goes all the way 1,000 miles to Jerusalem. And when he finally gets there, this odyssey, this trek, this pilgrimage, and by the way, I wonder why he went. What drew him from Ethiopia 1,000 miles? What do you think?
You got to imagine that there's a seeker heart here.
Yeah.
He's heard about the temple in Jerusalem. He's seen the character of the Jewish people,
Right.
From a polytheistic world. He's heard of a monotheistic
Here's
religion.
a one God. Yeah, right.
And he's curious.
Right. May have met some Jewish people, but he certainly met the God as he read that text. And he wants to know more about this. He wants to convert,
Right.
really. And Judaism, if you weren't born Jewish, you could convert to Judaism. You had to be circumcised. You had to obey there's some things you could do, but you could become a convert, a God-fearer. So he's going to convert. He's going to sign up. 1,000 miles. When he gets to Jerusalem, at the end of that long journey, imagine Dorothy trying to get to the Emerald City. When he finally gets there and he gets to the temple, there's a sign over the temple, and what does it say?
You're not welcome.
Yeah, it's a stiff arm.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's actual Josephus, the first century historian, says that there was he didn't have a picture of it, but he described this great big sign over the entrance to the temple with basically a list of who wasn't welcome to come in. Now, based on Scripture.
Right.
There were certain people who were not allowed to be worshiping among God's people, and there's a text that was probably on that list.
Yeah, in Deuteronomy chapter 23, the very first verse there, this section is all about who's going to be excluded from the assembly, and it says this: no one who's ever been emasculated, and then it goes on to describe the ways of which you can be emasculated, is welcome to enter into the assembly of the Lord. So he would be excluded from being able to go into the temple where Christianity really began its
That's right.
movement.
The very temple where all of those early moments were happening. It was the epicenter of God's whole movement. And he's barred from getting... Have you ever felt on the outside like that? I mean, might be because everybody was picking sides on the playground and you were a kid and you didn't get picked. I mean, or you're just on someone on the outside looking in. It's never a good feeling. I mean, to be stiff-armed in any environment, it doesn't matter what it is. You're not a member of our club kind of thing. You don't match up. In his case, he couldn't pass the physical.
Right.
And there have been times when people, it was the skin color or their gender or their ethnicity or whatever it was that just made them, they don't fit in, and we let them know they don't fit in. And that's a terrible feeling if you're on his side of it. So anyway, after that 1,000-mile journey and being rebuffed at the door, now he's on his way back. That's where the story picks up. He's not on the way there, he's on the way back after that experience. And that's at the point now that the Spirit is organizing this rendezvous. And so the Spirit says to Philip, I know you're in the desert, maybe it's high noon, now I want you to run.
Right.
Which is feeling like more and more ridiculous set of calling. But anyway, so now he's running in the desert. And now there's this chariot that he sees. And when you say chariot, I think we'd do better to imagine Western stagecoach, because as the text you said, he invited ultimately Philip to come up and sit with him in the chariot. So if you're thinking of Ben-Hur and just two guys behind you, it's a larger, more stagecoach kind of thing. Now imagine if you're this eunuch and he's got a stagecoach and he's the treasurer, so there's someone driving the stagecoach. Don't you know there's somebody with some arrows and spears up there guarding? What do you think when this crazy guy is running towards you in the middle of the desert? Doesn't that look like a stick-up? You know, I mean, it must look like a bandit. And it's amazing that Philip kept running because he's bound to see a bow and arrow aimed at him at this point. I mean, he would look like a crazy man.
Right.
And their job is to protect this high-ranking official. It's crazy that it just keeps running up. But before he gets all the way up there, and I guess within range of the archers maybe, he hears the guy reading. So he's not reading quietly, right?
It could be, so in the ancient manuscripts, it could be that the reason he's reading out loud is because the letters are all smushed together. There's no punctuation. And in order to make sense of the text, he's got to be reading it aloud. And so Philip overhears.
So he hears him. And fortunately, because if he was reading quietly, he might not have gotten close enough to survive.
And that's his doorway in.
That's his doorway in. And in fact, the word in the Greek for read is actually the word is read aloud. There really wasn't any such thing as silent reading, which is the way most of us read. Faith comes by hearing, Paul says. The Scripture is laid on the ear, not just on the eye. Faith comes by hearing. So they read aloud. Even when they were all by themselves, they read aloud, which, by the way, for those of us who tend to read quietly, there is a kind of power about, even on our own in private devotions, reading Scripture aloud.
Absolutely.
Or at least hearing a tape of some wonderful British accent reading it to you. But the reading of it aloud, it slows us down. It makes us watch phrasing. It really is. Anyway, so he's reading this aloud, and what's he reading? It's from Isaiah. If I had gone 1,000 miles and wanted to become a part of the group, and the group had stiff-armed me and told me you aren't welcome, and I had a copy of their Scripture, you know what I'd be doing with their Scripture? I'd be ripping it to shreds and lighting fires under it. Or when I'm rejected, I want to reject.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, I want to be angry and bitter. What is this guy doing? After all of that,
he's still searching.
He's still poring over the scroll. His hunger, his desire, his wish to know and be invited and included by this God he's beginning to get a sense from is so powerful that even when he hears the official word from those who should know God best at the very temple told him he can't come in, he's still trying to find a way in. Was it St. Augustine who said that our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you? There's something within all of us that our Creator has put that makes us long, and we're out of sorts until we find that puzzle piece where we finally find ourselves nestled into God, and he just won't give up. God bless him. I mean, God. So he's reading, and he reads from Isaiah, and the text, of course, is the prophet, one of these suffering songs, humiliation, no justice, no generations, and the eunuch is saying to Philip, well, Philip says, "Do you know what you're reading?"
How can I?
How can I?
Yeah.
So, that's when he invites him in, and the eunuch asks this question: who is the prophet talking about? Is he talking about himself? And scholars have, by the way, wondered about that passage in Isaiah a long time. Is he talking about himself, or could he be talking about someone else? Now, of course, Philip and all of us instantly know that absolutely it's one of those prophecies of the story of Jesus,
Right.
who is denied justice, who is humiliated, whose life is taken from him on the cross, who has no generations, he has no family, physical family, in order to create the largest spiritual family of them all.
Yeah.
So, of course, it's the story of Jesus, but and that's exactly where Philip's going to launch off on. But you have to know that the eunuch is seeing something even more than that, because he feels like he's had justice denied.
Right.
He has been humiliated.
There's not going to be any generation for him.
He will have no generations. You can't help but wonder if he's looking at that passage, and as he reads it aloud, if he's finding himself thinking, I know how that feels.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I feel. I had a favorite preacher friend of mine once who, commenting on this passage, said, what is the guy looking for? He's looking for his own name.
Yeah.
Or his own picture. It's like thumbing through a picture album. He's looking for his face. He's looking for his place still in the Bible. And he thinks he might have found it. And of course he's right. But it's a story also about Christ. So Philip talks about Christ and about how despite his humiliation, he's now exalted. Despite that he has no generations, he has all of us, all that. So it is certainly a witness, but I'm powerfully drawn to how this man keeps on looking to find his place.
Right.
And he's looking for his name, and indeed, I think he's certainly found it. And so then he asked a great question, which was probably maybe one of an early baptismal confession in the early church. Maybe right before they baptized, they probably said something about, does anything hinder this person? Meaning anything within them or outside of them. So this non-hindered is a real theme, not only in Acts, but of the early church. And so now it's the Ethiopian eunuch saying it. So what hinders me? Now I've heard about Christ. You've borne witness. In effect, he's saying, what's the fine print? I can't go through another disappointment. I just went 1,000 miles thinking I could be in and then wasn't allowed in. So go ahead and tell me now. That fast-talking person underneath the commercial, go ahead and tell me if this is going to be one more time of a stiff arm in the face. I just don't want. I can't get my hope up again. What's going to hinder me? And of course, Philip says,
If there's nothing that's going to hinder you here.
Yeah, absolutely. If God says yes to you, how dare we say no?
Right.
Now, Philip himself is learning just how wide God is saying yes. And he's already been to Samaria, as you said. I mean, the lay people are kind of ahead of the preachers here in this case. So he's certainly seeing how wide God's yes is taking them. If God says yes to you, you better believe we, the church, are not going to say no. And here's the deal. God is saying yes to everybody, even if that makes us uncomfortable.
The two of us were sort of wondering, so if you were to just unroll that scroll a little bit further.
Yeah, I said Philip started from that scripture. This is how you witness, by the way. Instead of having your own memorized script that you force the person you're witnessing into, start where they are. Start where their questions are and go from there. That's what Philip's very wise. But I'm thinking, so imagine a scroll. So it's not a book, a scroll. He's here in Isaiah 53. What would happen if Philip, now this is our holy imagination at work here, but it's really possible. What would it be like? Take the story.
If he were to just unroll the scripture a few chapters later, so we've already read Deuteronomy 23 that says who's excluded.
Yeah.
Just a few chapters later, he's reading from 52 and 53, the suffering servant there. In 56 of Isaiah, it says these words, starting in verse 2 and then through verse 5. Blessed is the one who does this, the person who holds fast, who keeps the Sabbath without desecrating, and keeps the hands from doing evil. Let no foreigner who is bound to the Lord say, the Lord will surely exclude me from his people. And let no eunuch complain, I am only a dry tree. And so we start to see that there is this room that God is creating for people who've been on the margins, who've been excluded. And the eunuch himself is mentioned just a few. So if he was looking for his own name and his own story, he's going to find it.
He really found his name 3 chapters over.
Exactly.
Philip said, oh, let me tell you, the best part's yet to come for you.
Exactly.
That's a powerful text, I think, and what a dramatic text, this opening up of, I know you think you knew the full counsel of God, but God's got a bigger heart and draws the circle a lot wider than you're thinking. Isaiah's getting him to there. And so here it is again. And so there is no fine print for him, and if not for him, then for any of us too, or for the person that we think is just a little further out than we are. There's no one that far out, not from God's reach. But how are they going to know that if we're not willing to go run in the heat of the desert to help share that word? So lo and behold, in the middle of the desert, guess what? There's a baptistry. There's an oasis. Look, here's water. Well, yeah, of course there is. And so they immediately get down out of the stagecoach, and he baptizes him. The Spirit takes Philip right off away, and the Ethiopian continues on his way back to Ethiopia. Curious, what's the legend about that?
And of course, the idea is that the Ethiopian goes and begins to minister to people in Ethiopia. And in fact, there's a church in Ethiopia today, which may draw its connection all the way back to this story and this individual.
The Ethiopian Coptic Orthodox Church. It's still, I guess, the only country in Africa that the primary religion is Christianity is Ethiopia. And it's been there for all of these years. We don't know for sure, but the legend is that this eunuch became the first bishop, that he actually planted the gospel there, which surely would have been what God would have been up to all along. It's a wonderful thought that might be the case. And so what's this text mean for us? Because most of us don't know very many Ethiopian eunuchs, nor have we been one. And it's easier to talk about and safer to talk about God welcoming this Ethiopian eunuch in if you don't, but there's actually a discomfort in this story. We miss the tension of the story if we don't realize that this was pushing the boundaries of what might it mean today.
The inclusion into the faith at that time was you've got to become Jewish first, which means you've got to be circumcised.
Which he
couldn't. So that's why he's excluded from the temple worship.
Exactly.
And for the early church, the mark of inclusion was baptism. And so he's received that mark. But it raises the question, who are the eunuchs among us? Who are the ones on the margin who God's longing to draw in?
So one question of this is, have you ever felt like you were the one shut out? And you know how that feels. Don't ever lose how that feels, because it'll help you have the compassion and the empathy to realize no one should feel that way, and certainly not about God's people. But to your point, who's that eunuch today? Who's on the outside looking in? Who feels like that if they showed up either in our little tiny circle or in our whole church, who would feel like that they don't quite fit in? Who would wonder if this is their place? Are they good enough? Do they look the part? It maybe again comes down to ethnicity and all those kind of things, or this is something in this guy's background. There are still people who really wonder if there's something that hinders them, and yet there is still that longing and hunger. And I'd say there's a seeking in God. God came to seek and to save the lost. So they're seeking each other. We sure have to help that seeking find its, But sadly, I think there are times when the church gets kind of comfortable with the club looking like us. We're not so different than the Jewish temple if we're not careful. And that's why this text is here. I'd say find the level of our discomfort. Who are you not comfortable around? Who doesn't, and could it be that God's calling you to run there? And what would that mean? What would it mean for the church? Love to hear what your thoughts are about that. But I think that's where this text stirs me some.
Right, and this passage is really the foreshadowing of a bigger movement that God is going to do. So we talked about the Acts 1:8 being the map for where this is all going, starting in Jerusalem, then to all Judea, into Samaria. Philip went up to Samaria, and to all the ends of the earth, and to the Ethiopian at the ends of the earth. And this is going to continue. In fact, next week, where we're going to pick it up is with the first Gentile convert.
Right.
His name is Cornelius. We're going to pick it up with chapter 10. Pastor Stephen and I will be here next week to pick up that story. And God continues to tear down walls and to expand the gospel into new places. And what an exciting journey it is going to be for us.
Yeah.
Well, we're glad that you were able to join us today. We look forward to having you back next week, and we'll see you then.
Right. Thank you.